Many troops hope to return home and find stability and serenity after years of serving their country. John McKee was no exception, and when his time in Afghanistan came to a close, he was eager to return to his previous way of life. But when John got home, he noticed that something wasn't quite right. The Marine eventually found himself in a situation he could never have imagined, one that would jeopardize his joyful welcome home. Even the local police and a biker group got engaged thanks to him. John McKee was raised in a military household. His father served in the military, just like his father before him, and all of his cousins had done the same. It seemed only right that John would also complete his required military service, and at the age of 25, he formally enlisted in the Marines. His family was quite supportive when he decided to join the military. And after serving in the US for a while, he was posted to Afghanistan. Although John's family and friends were proud of him for serving his nation, he couldn't help but long for the day when he might return home permanently. When that day finally came, John couldn't have been more delighted. He yearned for a simple life because he had witnessed enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. Fortunately, he had saved enough money to be able to buy a charming house for himself to return to with the aid of US military subsidies. From the minute John boarded the jet that would take him home until the moment he got off the plane, all he could think about was his family and his house. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him at home. After his deployment, John felt relieved to see the manicured lawns and peaceful neighborhoods outside his window. But as soon as John got out of the cab in front of his house, suspicion rapidly took the place of relief at being back home. After years of trusting his senses, John knew not to dismiss a troubling feeling like this. Something didn't feel right. In order to have free hands in case he needed them, he left his baggage at the front entrance. He then slowly made his way around the house's side to enter by the back door. As John rounded the back of the house, his gaze scanned the backyard. Although it appeared overgrown and disorganized, he didn't find it weird. Since he hadn't been there recently, it was only natural that things would be a little chaotic. He turned around and headed back to the house, reaching for the doorknob while reaching into his pocket for his keys. Before he could even use them, the knob turned smoothly, and John realized his terrible instinct had been accurate. His door was unlocked, but why? John managed to open the door silently. Even though he didn't know what was going on behind the door, he could sense trouble. When he entered the house fully, the foul scent was the first thing he noticed. As he moved deeper inside the home, he coughed and covered his nose. The home was in disarray. The few pieces of furniture he had bought before going on deployment were still there, but they were covered in junk and other miscellaneous objects. As John made his way through the house, it became increasingly obvious what was happening, despite John's desire to deny it. Squatters were the only explanation for why John's house was in such terrible shape. His home was obviously occupied by trespassers who had learned that it had been idle for years on end and were more than delighted to take advantage of a vacant residence. He immediately made a call to his parents, who were glad to provide him with a place to stay while he devised a strategy to restore his home to the condition in which he had originally purchased it. When John got back to his house, he did not anticipate such calm. John gave his family, whom he hadn't seen in a while, an embrace. He then positioned his suitcases before outlining the circumstance. John stopped his parents, who were startled and remorseful for not checking on the house more frequently. They were aging and finding it harder to do what they had been able to when they were younger. He never expected his parents to take care of his property, and no one could have foreseen this circumstance. But he still had to decide what to do next. The wisest course of action, according to his parents, would be to get in touch with the police. They could certainly find a solution for everything. To speak with a police officer face to face, John headed to the station. He informed them of the squatters in the hopes that they would be eager to go to the residence right away and get rid of them. A day or two later, John was surprised to hear from the police that they were powerless to intervene. They had been given some kind of documentation by the squatters that allowed them to temporarily occupy the property. John was more perplexed than he had ever been. Over him, the home's owner, the police trusted them. Without a battle, John wouldn't accept that response. He emphasized that the authorities needed to look into their possession of any documents further because they had been faked. He informed them that he was the real owner and criticized them for doing nothing to assist him. The police stated that they had no other options at this time because there wasn't enough proof. They advised John to retain legal counsel in order to help him set up the required legal procedures if he truly wanted to pursue this conflict. They did not say anything further before leaving. John tried his best to concentrate all of his efforts on locating the greatest attorney to represent him, since he knew that his dissatisfaction with law enforcement would not help him accomplish anything. John could not, however, feel that he was making any kind of progress because so many people were either too busy or made things too difficult. The squatters were still contentedly residing in John's home while his search for them was ineffective. After years of service to his country, he was becoming increasingly irate that neither the police nor the justice system would assist him. He understood that in order to tackle this problem, he would have to do something novel. John started looking into alternative strategies to safely and effectively evict these squatters from his house. He was having trouble finding anything until he came across a biker gang that was reputed to assist in resolving minor issues that the police disregarded. John went out to the leader of the biker club, explained the current circumstance, and asked if they might maybe assist him with this in the hopes that this might be the answer to his squatter problem. He didn't hold out much hope that the motorcyclists would be of help, but to his amazement, a few days later, he got a reply. The bikers were indignant at the contempt shown by the police and steadfast in their commitment to his cause. To hear the rest of John's story, they made the decision to meet him in person. The motorcyclists became even more invested after hearing it from him, and they started to come up with a strategy to reclaim his goods without breaking the law. The motorcyclists were aware that approaching the squatters peacefully would be the best way to start off any negotiations with them. John concurred that taking any sort of impulsive action was unnecessary. John and the bikers came to the consensus that everyone would travel to the house together, where John would lay out the legal circumstances and the bikers would serve as witnesses. The squatters should be reasonable and consent to leave the property, one would hope. Nobody would want a war to break out again, right? A large group of motorcycles followed John as he approached his home. He could only hope that the threat of his witnesses would persuade the squatters to stop causing trouble. He rang the doorbell. When it opened, John did his best to contain his rage and inform everyone within that he was the owner of the building and that they were residing there unlawfully. Despite his explanations, the squatters remained in the home they had been occupying for several months. They weren't finished, but John couldn't believe what he was hearing. There were a few people waiting in the doorway, but the person who opened it informed John that there was nowhere else for them to go. After a period, they had established their legal right to occupy the property and refused to leave of their own volition. Between John and the bikers and the squatters, an unspoken menace hung in the air. It seems force would be the only way to get them to depart. John attempted to reason with them once more, but they were uninterested in what he had to say, and tension increased between the two groups. John tried to talk to them quietly, but they started talking over him. They began calling him names and even threatening him. Even though John truly wanted to respond to the bikers, he realized that would not help him reclaim what was rightfully his. Both John and the bikers were aware that the situation might escalate. There was nothing John and the motorcyclists could do without facing legal ramifications, so they made the decision to pull back and gather their thoughts. They needed a whole new strategy now that they knew the squatters were hostile and not scared of violence. If anything was going to change, John realized pressure had to be put on the police as well as the squatters. And informing the media was the most effective method to achieve it. To see if anyone would be interested in covering this tale, he contacted the neighborhood newspapers and television stations. They certainly were. In fact, the growing problem piqued the eye of numerous local networks, and the subject gained local traction. It quickly went beyond even the statewide level and made national news. What was occurring on John's farm was widely known throughout the nation. John was unaware of the significance of involving the media in this matter. When news spread that John was not receiving legal or police assistance, people all around the nation became furious. Social media's influence put tremendous pressure on local government and law enforcement. There was no choice but to review the situation. The cops discovered a lot more evidence against the squatters and decided to take action because they had more time on their hands and more eyes watching their every move. The motorcyclists hoped that if the squatters knew that the police were ready to enter the house en masse to gather information and proof, they would be more willing to leave on their own. If John and they were to communicate, this whole situation might end. Those expectations were swiftly dashed when they arrived at John's farm. This time, the squatters were prepared for them and had their weapons ready behind barriers. The atmosphere was tight. John was reluctant to approach the house, as were the bikers. How did things get to be so violent? John moved the gang of motorcycles behind him as he walked in their direction. They were unlawfully residing on his property, he reiterated, and he was the legitimate owner of this house. Nobody moved. In fact, the group was concerned about the possibility of a violent conflict as the tension seemed to heighten. A woman then emerged from the residence. She seems to have been chosen as their leader. She shook her head in a way that caused John to halt in his tracks and hold his breath as he approached her to introduce himself. If John was the alleged owner of the house, the woman questioned him. John struggled to contain his annoyance. She must have heard what he had just said. The rudeness had him at his wit's end. He was being questioned in his own home. She was unimpressed when he told her he was. She needed him to present them with his ownership documents for the property if he was the true owner. She said that if he could question them, then they could also question him. John was furious, but before he could react more, the woman entered the house again. John made the decision to go back to the law. Despite the challenging procedure, he consented to work with a renowned real estate attorney who was committed to winning John's case and was known for winning cases like John's. It was exhausting to fight with the squatters in court while simultaneously trying to get John's documents back and attempting to disprove their falsity of theirs. John understood how grateful he was to have an attorney assisting him in dealing with these components of the problem because confrontation had obviously not worked. But enough was enough for the motorcyclists. They had become tired of the government's inaction and these squatters controlling the situation. They knew how to handle uncomfortable circumstances, and they created a plan of action using their knowledge. John continued to keep a close eye on the motorcycles as they started to take action slowly. He didn't want a conflict to break out physically. The squatters were subdued by the motorcyclists' efforts, and when the authorities intervened to take them into custody, the standoff was finally over. Thankfully, because of the riders' deft maneuvers, no one had been gravely injured during the nerve-wracking event. John handled the final of his affairs and drew a deep breath as the last of the squatters were evicted from the property and the bikers bid their goodbyes to him. The house was now once more his. John didn't mind spending the following few months deep cleaning and remodeling his home. He was eager to do so after the agonizing months he had spent fighting for his home previously. He saw this as a learning experience and was appreciative of all the people who had stood by him throughout the ordeal. While this problem first appeared hopeless, John's persistence and resolve in finding a solution demonstrate to us that anything can be resolved with hard effort and the willingness to ask for assistance, even from those you might not have considered seeking before. We're happy that John was able to finally settle into his own house, and we hope he may live the uncomplicated life filled with peace and quiet he's been longing for ever since he got off the plane.